The morning sun filtered through the frost-covered windows of Sandringham House on December 26, casting long shadows across the polished floors where King Charles III had walked countless times as a child, a prince, and, now as monarch. The Boxing Day air carried the scent of pine from the towering Christmas tree in the main hall, but also something else, the weight of responsibility that comes with being the keeper of traditions that stretch back generations. Charles moved through the familiar corridors with purpose, his footsteps echoing softly on the ancient wooden floors. In his hands, he carried a leather-bound journal that had belonged to his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. The pages were filled with her careful handwriting, documenting not just royal duties and state functions, but something far more personal, the exact details of every holiday tradition the family observed, down to the smallest ritual that might seem insignificant to outsiders but held deep meaning within the walls of royal residences. The Boxing Day tradition Charles was about to continue had started in 1952, the year his mother became queen. Every year on this day, the monarch would personally write thank-you notes to every member of the household staff, not the formal, typed letters that royal secretaries usually handled, but handwritten messages acknowledging each person's specific contributions to making the royal family's Christmas meaningful. From the chef who prepared the traditional Christmas pudding using a recipe dating back to Prince Albert, to the gardener who ensured the holly for decorations came from trees planted by Queen Victoria herself, each person received a personal note recognizing their role in preserving the royal legacy. But Charles knew this tradition went deeper than simple gratitude. As he settled into the morning room where his mother had performed this same ritual for 70 years, he understood that these handwritten notes represented something crucial about the monarchy's relationship with the people who served it. In an age where royal duties had become increasingly public and political, these private moments of recognition maintained the personal connections that had always been the foundation of royal service. The first name on his list was Mrs. Margaret Thompson, the head housekeeper who had worked at Sandringham for 43 years. She had been just 19 when she started, fresh from a village school and nervous about working in such a grand place. Now, at 62, she knew every secret passage in the house, every preference of every royal family member, and every story behind the hundreds of decorations that transformed Sandringham into a Christmas wonderland each year. Charles paused as he wrote her note, remembering how Mrs. Thompson had quietly handled the transition after his mother's death. While the world watched the formal ceremonies and official procedures, it was people like Mrs. Thompson who ensured that life inside the royal residences continued with dignity and grace. She had coordinated the removal of the Queen's personal Christmas decorations, items that held private family memories, and had carefully stored them so Charles could decide which ones to keep as part of the new traditions he would create. The Christmas tree in the main hall told its own story of transition and continuity. Following a tradition established by Prince Albert in 1840, the royal family's Christmas tree was always a Norwegian spruce, but this year's tree carried special significance. Among the ornaments hung alongside centuries-old royal decorations were several new additions that Charles had personally chosen. A small wooden angel that had belonged to his grandmother, the Queen Mother, now shared space with a delicate glass star that William and Catherine's children had made during a craft session at Kensington Palace. The tree represented not just the blending of old and new, but Charles's understanding that royal traditions must evolve while maintaining their essential character. In the corner of the morning room stood a smaller tree, one that few people outside the immediate royal family ever saw. This was the service tree, decorated entirely with ornaments that represented the various charities and organizations that the royal family supported. Each decoration told a story of community service and royal patronage, a tradition that Charles had started as Prince of Wales and now continued as king. The tree served as a daily reminder during the holiday season that royal privilege came with the responsibility of service to others. As Charles continued writing his notes, he reflected on the conversation he had with his private secretary the previous week about modernizing royal holiday traditions. The suggestion had been made that perhaps handwritten notes weren't necessary in the digital age, that a well-crafted email or even a video message might be more efficient and could reach more people. Charles had listened politely but firmly declined the suggestion. He understood that efficiency wasn't the point of these traditions, the personal investment of time and the physical act of writing by hand were exactly what made these gestures meaningful. The morning light shifted as Charles worked, illuminating family photographs scattered throughout the room. Among them was a picture from Christmas 1957, showing young Charles, barely 9 years old, helping his mother arrange flowers for the holiday table. In the background of the photo, barely visible, was a servant carefully polishing silver decorations that had been used for royal Christmas celebrations since the reign of George III. The continuity captured in that single image, the young prince learning from his mother while surrounded by objects that connected them to centuries of royal history, perfectly illustrated why these traditions mattered so much to Charles. The door opened quietly as one of the younger staff members brought in the morning tea service. James Collins, 24 years old and, in his second year of royal service, moved with the careful precision that all royal staff learned. He had been hired during the transition period after the Queen's death, which meant that Charles's first Christmas as king was also James's first royal Christmas. The young man's nervousness was evident in the way he carefully positioned the tea service, double-checking that everything was exactly as protocol demanded. Charles looked up from his writing and smiled. "James, isn't it? How are you finding your first royal Christmas?" The informality of the question clearly surprised the young man, who had probably expected nothing more than a formal nod of acknowledgement. "Very well, Your Majesty, thank you. It's quite different from what I expected." "Different how?" Charles asked, genuinely curious about a newcomer's perspective on traditions he had known all his life. James hesitated before answering, clearly unsure about how honest he should be. "Well, sir, I thought it would be more formal, I suppose. Grand ceremonies and elaborate protocols. But it feels more like a family gathering that happens to take place in a palace." Charles smiled at the observation. It was exactly right, and exactly what he hoped to preserve as the monarchy evolved. "That's very perceptive of you, James. These traditions work because they're about people, not just procedures. Every decoration in this house, every meal we share, every small ritual we observe, they all connect us to the people who came before and the people who will come after." After James left, Charles returned to his notes with renewed appreciation for what he was doing. The young man's observation reminded him that maintaining these traditions wasn't about clinging to the past, but about preserving the human connections that gave meaning to royal service. Each handwritten note he was completing represented a relationship, a recognition that the monarchy's continuity depended not just on constitutional principles or legal frameworks, but on the daily dedication of real people who chose to invest their lives in maintaining something larger than themselves. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 11 as Charles finished the last of his staff notes. Outside, he could see members of the public gathering along the road that bordered Sandringham Estate, hoping for a glimpse of the royal family's traditional Boxing Day walk. It was another tradition that would require his attention soon, the careful balance of public accessibility and family privacy that had become increasingly complex in the age of social media and constant connectivity. But, for now, in the quiet of the morning room surrounded by family photographs and personal mementos, Charles felt the satisfaction of completing a tradition that connected him directly to his mother's legacy and to the countless servants who had made royal life possible across the generations. The handwritten notes would be delivered personally later that day, continuing a chain of human recognition that stretched back to the early days of his mother's reign. As he prepared to move on to the next tradition on his schedule, the review of the Christmas guest list for the following year, Charles picked up his mother's journal once more. On the page marked December 26, in her distinctive handwriting, was a note that she had written just before her final Christmas: "The greatest gift we can give to those who serve alongside us is the recognition that their contributions matter, that their work preserves something precious, and that they are seen and valued as individuals, not just as roles to be filled." Reading those words, Charles understood that his commitment to maintaining these traditions wasn't just about honoring the past, it was about ensuring that future generations would understand the personal relationships and human connections that had always been the true foundation of the British monarchy. 3 days after Boxing Day, as the last traces of Christmas festivities began to fade from most British homes, King Charles III stood in the private chapel at Sandringham, preparing for one of the most intimate and least known traditions of the royal holiday season. The Chapel of St. Mary Magdalene, with its weathered stone walls and stained glass windows that had witnessed countless royal prayers across the centuries, would host the annual gratitude service, a ceremony that existed nowhere in official royal protocols but had been observed by the Windsor family for over a century. The tradition had begun during World War I, when King George V, Charles's great-grandfather, instituted a private service of thanksgiving to be held during the week between Christmas and New Year's Day. The service wasn't for public consumption or media coverage, it was purely for the royal family and their closest staff to reflect on the year that had passed and to acknowledge the privileges and responsibilities of their positions. During the darkest days of the war, when royal families across Europe were falling and British society was transforming rapidly, George V understood that the monarchy's survival would depend on maintaining its connection to something larger than politics or power. Charles adjusted the simple wooden kneeler that had been placed before the altar, the same one his mother had knelt on for 70 years of these services. The chapel was illuminated only by candles, their flickering light casting dancing shadows on the memorial plaques that lined the walls, reminders of family members, servants, and soldiers whose lives had intersected with the royal story across generations. The absence of electric lighting was intentional. This tradition deliberately stripped away the grandeur and formality that characterized most royal ceremonies, creating a space for genuine reflection rather than public display. The first to arrive were the senior household staff, men and women who had served the royal family for decades and who understood the significance of being included in such a private moment. Mrs. Thompson, the head housekeeper, entered quietly and took her place in a pew near the back, her presence representing not just her own years of service but the countless individuals who had maintained royal residences across the centuries. Behind her sat the head gardener, whose family had tended the Sandringham grounds for 4 generations, and the estate manager, whose detailed knowledge of every building and tradition made him an invaluable guardian of royal history. Princess Anne arrived next, her practical nature evident in her choice to walk from the main house despite the bitter December cold. She had been attending this service for 53 years, since she was old enough to understand its significance, and her commitment to the tradition reflected her understanding that royal duty extended far beyond public engagements and official ceremonies. Her presence also represented continuity. She would likely be one of the family members responsible for explaining these traditions to future generations, ensuring that their meaning wouldn't be lost as the monarchy continued to evolve. William and Catherine entered with their children, the young princes and princess, clearly aware that this was a special occasion but perhaps not yet fully understanding the weight of the traditions they were inheriting. Charles watched as Catherine quietly helped Princess Charlotte understand the significance of the service, explaining in whispered words how this tradition connected them to all the royal children who had participated in similar ceremonies across the decades. The sight reminded Charles of his own childhood participation in these services, when his mother had similarly guided him through his early understanding of what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. The service began not with formal prayers or ceremonial readings, but with a simple invitation for each person present to share one moment from the past year that had reminded them why their work or their position mattered. This sharing tradition had evolved organically over the decades, starting with George V's personal reflections and gradually expanding to include the voices of family members and staff alike. The democratic nature of the sharing, where a kitchen assistant's observations carried equal weight with royal perspectives, reflected the family's understanding that preserving these traditions required the commitment of everyone involved, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. Mrs. Thompson spoke first, her voice steady despite the emotion in her words. She described a moment from earlier in the year when she had been showing a new staff member through the private family quarters, explaining the care required for handling objects that held personal significance rather than just historical value. "I realized," she said, "that we're not just maintaining a house or even preserving history. We're taking care of the physical objects that hold a family's memories, and that's a responsibility that goes far beyond cleaning and organizing." Her words resonated through the small chapel, highlighting something that public discussions of the monarchy rarely addressed: the intimate, personal dimension of royal life that required the same careful attention as any family's most treasured possessions. Charles nodded as she spoke, remembering his own recognition of this truth during the difficult months after his mother's death, when the task of sorting through her personal belongings had revealed the depth of meaning invested in objects that might appear unremarkable to outsiders. William shared his reflection on a conversation he had had with his eldest son, Prince George, about the weight of future responsibilities. "George asked me whether being king would mean he couldn't have hobbies or interests outside of royal duties," William said. "It made me think about how we explain to our children that these traditions and responsibilities are not limitations, but opportunities to contribute to something that has meaning beyond our individual lives." His words captured the challenge every generation of royals faced, helping their children understand that inheriting these roles meant accepting both extraordinary privilege and extraordinary responsibility. The head gardener, a man in his 70s who had rarely spoken in such formal settings, surprised everyone by sharing a story about discovering a letter that Queen Victoria had written to the gardener's great-great-grandfather in 1887, thanking him for creating a garden display that had brought joy to her grandchildren. "Finding that letter," he said, "made me understand that the work we do here isn't just about maintaining beautiful grounds. It's about creating spaces where families can make memories that last across generations." His observation perfectly captured how these traditions work, each generation of caregivers and family members adding their own contributions while preserving the essential character of what had come before. Catherine spoke about her first Christmas as a member of the royal family, describing how overwhelming it had initially felt to participate in traditions that carried such historical weight. "I worried about doing something wrong, about not understanding the proper way to handle objects or observe ceremonies that had been perfected over centuries," she admitted. "But I learned that these traditions survive not because they're performed perfectly, but because they're performed with genuine care and respect for their meaning." Her words offered reassurance to the newer staff members present, acknowledging that learning these traditions was an ongoing process that required patience and understanding rather than immediate perfection. Charles himself spoke last, sharing his reflections on the year that had passed and his growing understanding of how these private traditions supported the public role of the monarchy. "This year has taught me that maintaining these customs isn't about preserving the past unchanged," he said. "It's about understanding what made them meaningful in the first place and ensuring that those essential qualities survive even as the world around us continues to change." He went on to describe his decision to maintain the handwritten note tradition despite suggestions that digital alternatives might be more efficient. "The time and effort required to write each note by hand isn't a burden, it's the point," he explained. "These traditions work because they require us to invest something of ourselves in them. They remind us that being part of this institution means accepting that some things are worth doing simply because they connect us to the people who came before and the people who will come after." Following the sharing, the service continued with readings from texts that had been chosen by different monarchs over the years. Charles had selected a passage from John Ruskin's Unto This Last, which emphasized the responsibility that comes with privilege and the importance of using advantages in service of others. The choice reflected his lifelong commitment to environmental and social causes, but it also demonstrated how each monarch had used these services to highlight the values they hoped to emphasize during their reign. The final element of the service was perhaps the most moving, a moment of silent reflection where each person present was invited to consider how they would contribute to preserving and evolving these traditions in the coming year. This silence, lasting several minutes, allowed everyone to internalize the significance of what they had shared and to make personal commitments about their roles in maintaining the royal legacy. As the service concluded and the participants began to leave the chapel, Charles remained behind for a few additional minutes of private prayer. This personal time had been part of his routine since childhood, but it had taken on new meaning since becoming king. The weight of being the final decision-maker about which traditions to maintain, which to modify, and which to allow to fade away was something that no amount of preparation could fully anticipate. Looking at the memorial plaques that lined the chapel walls, Charles was reminded that he was part of a chain of individuals who had each faced the challenge of preserving essential values while allowing for necessary change. Each of his predecessors had made decisions about traditions, some of which had survived to the present day, others of which had been allowed to evolve or disappear. His responsibility was to make similar decisions with the same careful attention to what was essential and what was merely habitual. The candlelight flickered as a winter wind rattled the ancient windows, but the warmth generated by the shared reflections and commitments of the service remained. Charles understood that this tradition, more than almost any other, captured what he hoped to preserve about the monarchy: its capacity to create genuine human connections across differences in position and background, its ability to connect personal meaning with public service, and its power to maintain continuity while allowing for growth and evolution. As he finally prepared to leave the chapel, Charles touched the wooden kneeler his mother had used for so many years, silently renewing his commitment to ensuring that future generations would have the opportunity to participate in similar moments of reflection and dedication. These traditions would survive, he understood, not because they were required by law or protocol, but because they continued to provide meaning and connection for the people who chose to invest themselves in maintaining them. New Year's Eve at Balmoral Castle arrived with the kind of penetrating Scottish cold that seemed to seep through stone walls despite centuries of careful construction and modern heating systems. King Charles III stood in the castle's library, surrounded by leather-bound volumes that documented not just British history but the personal records of royal celebrations dating back to Queen Victoria's first New Year at Balmoral in 1848. Tonight would mark his participation in perhaps the most private and least understood of all royal holiday traditions, the Midnight Covenant, a ceremony that existed in no official records but had been observed by every British monarch for nearly 2 centuries. The tradition had originated with William IV, Charles's great-great-great-uncle, who had instituted a private moment of commitment renewal to be observed at the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve. Unlike the public celebrations that marked the new year for most of the population, this royal tradition focused on the personal promises that connected each monarch to the responsibilities of their position. The ceremony had survived the constitutional crises of the 19th century, 2 world wars, the abdication crisis of 1936, and countless political upheavals because it addressed something more fundamental than politics: the personal character required to serve in a role that demanded lifelong dedication. Charles had chosen to observe this tradition at Balmoral rather than at one of the more formal royal residences because the Scottish castle represented the place where his family felt most connected to their private selves rather than their public roles. Here, surrounded by the wild beauty of the Highlands and the memories of countless family gatherings, he could engage with these traditions as a person rather than as an institution. The informality of Balmoral allowed for the kind of honest self-reflection that these traditions required. The library where Charles waited for midnight had been his grandmother's favorite room during her visits to Balmoral. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, had spent countless evenings in this space, reading to her grandchildren and sharing stories about royal traditions that weren't recorded in any official histories. Charles remembered sitting in this same room as a boy, listening to her explain why certain customs mattered and how they had helped previous generations of royals navigate the challenges of their unique position. At 11:30, Charles was joined by his valet, Mr. Henderson, a man who had served the royal family for 38 years and who represented the continuity of service that made these traditions possible. Henderson carried with him a wooden box that appeared unremarkable but contained objects that connected Charles to every monarch who had observed this tradition before him. The box had been crafted in 1837 during Queen Victoria's first year on the throne, and each subsequent monarch had added one personal item to its contents. Inside the box, carefully wrapped in silk that had been replaced countless times over the decades, were the tokens left by each of Charles's predecessors. Queen Victoria had contributed a small wooden cross that she had carved herself during her first Christmas as queen, a reminder of the personal faith that had sustained her through 63 years of reign. Edward VII had added a fountain pen that he had used to sign his first official document as king, representing his commitment to taking his constitutional duties seriously despite his reputation for enjoying life's pleasures. George V's contribution was a photograph of British soldiers during World War I, a reminder of the monarchy's role in providing stability during national crises. Edward VIII, despite his brief reign and controversial abdication, had left behind a small compass, perhaps representing his recognition that royal duty required a clear sense of direction even when personal desires pointed elsewhere. George VI had contributed a speech he had written but never delivered, acknowledging his struggles with public speaking while demonstrating his commitment to overcoming personal limitations for the sake of his role. Elizabeth's second addition to the collection was characteristically thoughtful, a small notebook containing brief observations about the changing nature of royal service that she had written during her first decade as queen. Charles had read these observations many times over the years, drawing wisdom from his mother's insights about how to maintain essential royal values while adapting to social and political changes. Her words had proven prophetic in many ways, anticipating challenges that the monarchy would face in later decades. As the clock approached midnight, Charles opened the notebook to a passage his mother had written in 1962. The monarchy survives not because it refuses to change, but because it changes thoughtfully, preserving what serves the nation while releasing what no longer provides value. Each generation must decide what to keep and what to leave behind, but these decisions must be made with wisdom rather than convenience as the guide. At precisely midnight, as Big Ben's chimes echoed faintly through radio broadcasts around the world, Charles began the ritual that would mark his own commitment to the year ahead. Following the pattern established by his predecessors, he took out a piece of paper and wrote 3 personal promises that would guide his approach to royal service in the coming year. These weren't constitutional commitments or political pledges, they were personal vows that addressed the character qualities he hoped to cultivate and the standards he hoped to maintain in his private conduct as well as his public role. The first promise Charles wrote concerned his relationship with the people who worked alongside him in royal service. He committed to maintaining the personal connections that made these traditions meaningful rather than merely ceremonial. This meant continuing practices like the handwritten thank you notes and personal conversations with staff members, but it also meant remaining open to their insights and perspectives rather than becoming isolated by the formalities of his position. His second commitment addressed his role as a guardian of royal traditions. Charles promised to approach decisions about maintaining or modifying customs with careful thought rather than either rigid conservatism or casual modernization. Each tradition would be evaluated based on whether it continued to serve meaningful purposes rather than simply surviving from habit. This commitment reflected his understanding that preservation required active choice rather than passive acceptance. The third promise was perhaps the most personal, a commitment to maintaining the qualities of curiosity, compassion, and humility that had guided him as Prince of Wales. Charles recognized that the elevation to king could easily lead to isolation from the concerns of ordinary people, and he vowed to resist that tendency by continuing to engage personally with the causes and communities he had supported throughout his life. After writing these commitments, Charles followed the tradition of adding his own token to the collection that future monarchs would inherit. He had chosen a small wooden button from a coat that had belonged to his great-grandfather, George VI, a reminder that even kings were, in many ways, ordinary people who happened to inherit extraordinary responsibilities. The button represented his hope that future generations would remember that royal service required human qualities rather than superhuman perfection. The ceremony concluded with Charles reading aloud the promises written by each of his predecessors, a practice that connected him directly to the personal commitments of the monarchs who had faced their own unique challenges while serving in the same role. Hearing Queen Victoria's promise to rule with justice tempered by mercy, George V's commitment to serve the nation's needs rather than personal preferences, and his mother's vow to maintain dignity without losing touch with humanity reminded Charles that he was part of a legacy of individuals who had each grappled with the demands of royal service. Outside the library windows, the Scottish Highlands stretched into darkness, their ancient landscape unchanged by the human ceremonies taking place within the castle walls. This perspective had always been important to Charles during his years at Balmoral, the reminder that royal traditions, however meaningful to those who observed them, were small human rituals taking place within the context of something much larger and more enduring. The monarchy's survival depended on maintaining this sense of proportion, understanding both the significance and the limitations of royal service. As Charles prepared to leave the library, carrying the wooden box that would be stored safely until the following New Year's Eve, he reflected on how this tradition differed from the public ceremonies that most people associated with royal life. The Midnight Covenant required no audience, no media coverage, no public validation. Its power came from its privacy and its focus on personal character rather than public performance. In a role that often required him to be a symbol rather than an individual, these moments of private commitment allowed him to engage with his responsibilities as a person making conscious choices rather than simply fulfilling predetermined obligations. The tradition also served as a reminder that royal service was fundamentally about individual character rather than institutional structures. The monarchy's laws and constitutional frameworks provided important guidance, but they couldn't substitute for the personal integrity and commitment that each monarch brought to the role. The Midnight Covenant ensured that every new year began with a renewal of that personal commitment, connecting each monarch to the human qualities that made royal service meaningful. Walking through the quiet corridors of Balmoral as the castle settled into the early hours of the new year, Charles carried with him the weight and comfort of knowing that he had made his promises not just to his subjects or to abstract principles, but to the specific individuals who had served in this role before him and who had each found their own ways of meeting its challenges. Their tokens in the wooden box represented not just historical artifacts but personal testimonies to the possibility of serving with integrity and purpose despite the complexities and contradictions inherent in the royal position. The year ahead would bring its own challenges and opportunities, its own decisions about which traditions to maintain and which to modify, its own tests of the character qualities Charles had promised to cultivate. But the Midnight Covenant had provided him with a foundation of personal commitment that would guide those decisions and sustain him through whatever difficulties might arise. In a role that often felt defined by external expectations and constitutional requirements, this tradition ensured that every year began with a moment of internal reflection and personal choice. The morning of January 6 dawned crisp and clear at Windsor Castle, marking Twelfth Night and the official end of the Christmas season according to royal tradition. For most of the British public, the holidays had ended days earlier with the return to work after New Year's Day, but within royal residences, the celebration continued until Epiphany, following customs that connected the Windsor family to centuries of Christian tradition and European royal heritage. King Charles III stood in the green drawing room, preparing to oversee one of the most symbolically significant yet virtually unknown traditions of the royal calendar, the passing of the light ceremony. This tradition had evolved gradually over more than a century, beginning as a simple family custom during the reign of George V and developing into an elaborate ritual that marked both the end of one holiday season and the preparation for the next. The ceremony involved the careful dismantling of Christmas decorations throughout Windsor Castle, but, unlike the efficient removal that might take place in ordinary homes, every ornament, every garland, and every festive element was handled according to specific protocols that honored both its artistic value and its role in royal family history. The green drawing room served as the central staging area for this process because it contained the castle's most significant Christmas display, a collection of decorations that included items dating back to Prince Albert's innovations in the 1840s, ornaments created by royal children across multiple generations, and pieces that had been gifts from world leaders and foreign dignitaries. Each item told a story not just of Christmas celebration but of diplomatic relationships, family bonds, and artistic traditions that had evolved alongside the monarchy itself. Charles began the ceremony by lighting a single candle from the flame that had burned continuously in the castle's chapel throughout the Christmas season. This flame, known as the royal light, was maintained according to a tradition that symbolized the continuity of royal service across changing seasons and changing years. The same flame that had illuminated Christmas prayers would now guide the transition back to ordinary time, carrying forward the spiritual significance of the holiday season into the year's regular activities. Mrs. Sarah Williams, the senior curator of the royal collection, joined Charles in the drawing room along with a carefully selected team of conservators, housekeeping staff, and security personnel. Each person present had specific responsibilities for handling different categories of decorative items, and their expertise ensured that priceless historical artifacts received appropriate care while less significant pieces were managed efficiently. Mrs. Williams had overseen this ceremony for 15 years, and her deep knowledge of every item's provenance and significance made her an invaluable guide to the complex decisions involved in the process. The first items to be addressed were the ornaments on the main Christmas tree, a magnificent Norwegian spruce that dominated the drawing room. Charles personally removed the ornament placed at the top of the tree, a star that had been created by Queen Victoria herself in 1847 and had crowned every royal Christmas tree since then. The star's simple design, fashioned from silver and glass in an era before elaborate commercial decorations, represented the personal investment that royal family members had always made in creating meaningful holiday celebrations rather than simply purchasing expensive displays. As Charles carefully wrapped the star in its protective cloth, he remembered the conversation he had had with his mother during his first Christmas as king about which traditions deserved priority when time and resources were limited. Some customs survive because they're beautiful, she had told him, others because they're convenient, and still others because they connect us to essential truths about who we are and what we represent. The challenge is distinguishing between the three categories and making choices accordingly. The ornament removal continued with methodical precision, each piece being examined, catalogued, and stored according to its specific requirements. Ancient silk ribbons needed different care than modern glass balls, while ornaments with personal significance to family members required special handling regardless of their monetary value. Prince George's handmade paper angel, created during a school art project the previous autumn, received the same careful attention as a crystal ornament that had been a gift from the German Kaiser in 1912. This equality of treatment reflected one of Charles's fundamental beliefs about royal traditions, that their meaning came not from their material value but from the care and intention invested in them. The paper angel made by his grandson carried the same weight as the historical artifacts because both represented the human connections that made these traditions meaningful across generations. By treating every ornament with equal respect, the ceremony reinforced the idea that royal customs served to honor relationships rather than simply display wealth. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, arrived with Princess Charlotte to participate in their portion of the ceremony. Catherine had been assigned responsibility for the garlands that decorated the drawing room's mantelpieces, while Charlotte would help with the smaller decorative elements that were placed within reach of children. This inclusion of family members in the dismantling process served multiple purposes. It provided practical assistance, ensured that younger generations understood the care required for these traditions, and maintained the family atmosphere that had always characterized royal holiday celebrations. Charlotte's participation was particularly significant because it represented the conscious effort to include royal children in both the joyful and the mundane aspects of maintaining family traditions. Rather than experiencing only the magical appearance of Christmas decorations, she was learning that preserving holiday traditions required consistent effort and attention to detail throughout the year. Her careful handling of delicate ornaments, guided by her mother's patient instruction, demonstrated how royal children learned responsibility through participation rather than observation. The ceremony continued with the removal of garlands from doorways, mantelpieces, and staircases throughout the staterooms. Each garland contained a mixture of fresh greenery, preserved elements, and decorative additions that had been assembled by royal gardeners according to designs that balanced historical authenticity with contemporary safety and preservation requirements. The fresh elements would be composted in the castle's gardens, returning to the earth that had produced them, while preserved pieces would be stored for potential reuse in future years. Charles paid particular attention to a garland that had been placed above the fireplace in the White Drawing Room, because it contained holly from trees that he had personally planted during his years as Prince of Wales. Seeing the results of his decades-old environmental efforts incorporated into royal Christmas traditions provided a tangible connection between his personal passions and his royal responsibilities. The garland represented the possibility of integrating individual interests with institutional obligations rather than viewing them as competing demands. The afternoon portion of the ceremony involved the most complex and delicate task, the dismantling of the nativity scene that had been displayed in the castle's private chapel. This display included figures that dated from the 18th century alongside more recent additions that had been contributed by various family members over the years. Each figure required individual wrapping and storage in climate-controlled conditions, but the process also provided an opportunity for reflection on the religious significance that underpinned many royal traditions. Charles had always understood his role as defender of the faith to encompass not just constitutional responsibilities but personal spiritual commitment, and the nativity scene represented the intersection of public religious duties with private faith. As he carefully wrapped the figure of the infant Jesus, a piece carved by a royal craftsman in 1887 to commemorate Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, he reflected on how religious traditions provided both continuity and challenge for the modern monarchy. The royal family's religious observances needed to honor the Christian heritage that remained central to British constitutional arrangements while acknowledging the religious diversity of contemporary British society. Charles's own interfaith interests and environmental advocacy had sometimes created tension with more traditional religious expectations, but he had found that participating sincerely in established traditions like the nativity display could deepen rather than diminish his appreciation for broader spiritual values. The final element of the ceremony involved the formal extinguishing of the royal light that had burned throughout the Christmas season. This wasn't simply a matter of blowing out a candle. Instead, the flame was transferred to a smaller candle that would be preserved until the following Christmas, maintaining the continuity of light across the year. The preserved flame would be used to light the first Christmas candle of the next season, creating an unbroken chain of illumination that connected each holiday celebration to all those that had preceded it. As Charles performed this flame transfer in the presence of the chapel's dean and the other ceremony participants, he was reminded of his mother's favorite observation about royal traditions: they work not because they never change, but because they change slowly enough for people to understand and accept the evolution. The royal light tradition perfectly embodied this principle, maintaining its essential symbolism while adapting its practical implementation to contemporary safety requirements and changing religious sensibilities. The ceremony concluded with a brief blessing offered by the dean, acknowledging the completion of another Christmas season and asking for guidance during the year ahead. This religious element wasn't required by any constitutional provision or official protocol, but it reflected the personal faith that had sustained the Windsor family through multiple generations of service. The blessing also served as a reminder that royal traditions existed within a larger context of spiritual and moral values that transcended politics and personal preference. As the participants dispersed and the drawing room returned to its non-holiday appearance, Charles remained for a few minutes of personal reflection. The room looked dramatically different without its Christmas decorations, but the care with which every element had been removed and preserved ensured that next year's celebration could build upon this year's foundation while allowing for new additions and modifications. Looking around the now sparse drawing room, Charles understood that this tradition captured something essential about his approach to royal service: the commitment to maintaining what was valuable from the past while remaining open to growth and change. The ceremony had required hours of careful work from dozens of people, but that investment of time and effort was precisely what made the tradition meaningful. Easy customs rarely survived across generations. Lasting traditions required the kind of deliberate commitment that the passing of the light ceremony represented. The wooden boxes containing this year's ornaments would rest in carefully controlled storage for 11 months, waiting for their next opportunity to bring beauty and meaning to royal celebrations. But the relationships, memories, and commitments that had been strengthened during the ceremony would continue to influence royal service throughout the year, ensuring that the spirit of the season extended far beyond its official dates. 6 months later, on a warm July evening at Buckingham Palace, King Charles III sat in his private study reviewing the detailed plans that had been prepared for the upcoming Christmas season. The irony wasn't lost on him that the most intense planning for royal holiday traditions took place during the height of summer, when Christmas seemed impossibly distant to most people. Yet this careful advance preparation was exactly what allowed those traditions to appear effortless and natural when December arrived, disguising months of detailed coordination behind an impression of spontaneous family celebration. The documents spread across his desk told the story of how royal Christmas traditions survived and evolved in the modern era. Detailed schedules coordinated the movements of family members across multiple residences, ensuring that ancient customs could be observed while accommodating contemporary security requirements, media obligations, and international diplomatic responsibilities. Budget projections balanced the cost of maintaining historical authenticity with practical considerations of efficiency and sustainability. Personnel assignments ensured that every tradition would have the skilled staff necessary to execute it properly while providing adequate rest and family time for the hundreds of individuals whose work made royal celebrations possible. Charles paused at a memo from Mrs. Williams, the senior curator, requesting his decision about incorporating new ornaments that had been created by local artisans as part of a craft revival initiative he had supported as Prince of Wales. The ornaments were beautiful and represented exactly the kind of community engagement he hoped to encourage, but adding them to the Royal Christmas collection required careful consideration of how they would fit with existing decorative schemes and whether their inclusion would create expectations for similar additions in future years. This decision perfectly illustrated the ongoing challenge of maintaining royal traditions. Every choice about modification or addition created precedents that would influence the monarchy for generations to come. Charles couldn't simply decide what he personally preferred, he needed to consider how each choice would affect the ability of future monarchs to maintain these traditions while making their own meaningful contributions. The burden of being the temporary custodian of practices that needed to survive far beyond his own reign was something he felt particularly acutely during these planning sessions. A knock on the study door interrupted his review as his private secretary, Sir Michael Thompson, entered with additional documents that had arrived throughout the day. Among them was a detailed report from the head of palace security outlining new protocols that would be necessary to accommodate the increasing public interest in royal holiday traditions while maintaining the family's privacy and safety. The report included proposals for expanded public viewing areas for the Boxing Day walk, enhanced screening procedures for holiday church services, and modified transportation arrangements that would balance accessibility with security concerns. Sir Michael also brought a letter from the Archbishop of Canterbury regarding the religious elements of royal Christmas celebrations. The Archbishop had thoughtfully outlined opportunities to emphasize the spiritual significance of these traditions while acknowledging the religious diversity of modern Britain. His suggestions included incorporating elements from different Christian traditions represented within the Commonwealth, adding prayers that reflected contemporary social concerns, and finding ways to make royal religious observances more accessible to people of various backgrounds and beliefs. These documents reminded Charles that royal traditions couldn't exist in isolation from the broader social and political context in which they took place. The monarchy's Christmas celebrations needed to honor their historical Christian foundations while remaining relevant to a multicultural society. They needed to maintain their special character while demonstrating appropriate sensitivity to economic inequality and social challenges. Most importantly, they needed to preserve their meaning and authenticity while adapting to changing security and media environments. Charles set aside the formal documents and picked up a more personal item that had arrived in the day's correspondence, a handwritten letter from his grandson, Prince George, asking detailed questions about the traditions he would inherit. George's questions revealed a thoughtful young mind grappling with the weight of future responsibilities while maintaining the natural curiosity of childhood. He wanted to know why certain customs had survived while others had been abandoned, whether he would be allowed to add his own contributions to family traditions, and how he could prepare himself to handle these responsibilities wisely. The letter touched Charles deeply because it demonstrated that the careful effort to include royal children in these traditions was achieving its intended purpose. George wasn't simply accepting these customs as unchangeable requirements, he was thinking critically about their meaning and considering how he might contribute to their evolution. His question showed exactly the kind of engaged, thoughtful approach that would be necessary to ensure these traditions continue to serve meaningful purposes rather than becoming empty ceremonies. Charles began drafting his response to George's letter, using the opportunity to articulate his own understanding of how royal traditions should evolve. "The customs we observe during Christmas aren't preserved because they're perfect," he wrote, "but because they help us remember what's important and connect us to the people who share our responsibilities. When you inherit these traditions, your job won't be to keep them exactly the same, but to understand what makes them meaningful and to ensure that meaning doesn't get lost as they continue to change." He went on to explain how each generation of royals had faced similar questions about balancing preservation with innovation, and how the traditions that survived were those that had found ways to maintain their essential purposes while adapting to new circumstances. "Your great-grandmother made changes that helped these customs serve the needs of her time," he wrote, "and you'll need to make changes that serve the needs of yours. The key is making sure that the changes strengthen rather than weaken the connections these traditions create between our family and the people we serve." As Charles worked on the letter, he was interrupted by a call from William, who wanted to discuss his own observations about preparing his children for their future roles in these traditions. William had been reflecting on his conversation with George about royal responsibilities, and he wanted to coordinate with his father about the messages they were sending to the next generation about the meaning and importance of these customs. "I've been thinking about what you said during the gratitude service," William told his father, "about how these traditions work because they require us to invest something of ourselves in them. I want to make sure George, Charlotte, and Louis understand that their participation in these customs is meaningful precisely because it requires effort and attention, not despite it." The conversation that followed highlighted the ongoing challenge of royal parenting, helping children understand the significance of their unique position while encouraging them to develop their own sense of purpose and direction. William and Charles discuss strategies for making royal traditions feel like opportunities for meaningful contribution rather than burdensome obligations, and they explored ways to help the children understand how their individual interests and talents could enhance rather than conflict with their royal responsibilities. Their discussion also touched on the practical challenges of maintaining these traditions in an increasingly complex world. Social media had created new expectations for public access to royal family life, while also generating new risks to privacy and security. Environmental concerns had raised questions about the sustainability of certain traditional practices, requiring creative solutions that honored both historical authenticity and contemporary values. Political polarization had made it more difficult to maintain the monarchy's traditional role above party politics while still addressing social issues that mattered to royal family members. After ending the call with William, Charles returned to his review of the Christmas planning documents with a renewed appreciation for the complexity of what his family was attempting to preserve. These traditions worked because they balanced multiple competing demands, honoring the past while remaining relevant to the present, maintaining exclusivity while demonstrating accessibility, preserving privacy while satisfying public interest, and upholding religious heritage while respecting contemporary diversity. The key insight that emerged from his review was that successful preservation of these traditions required constant active choice rather than passive acceptance. Every element of every custom needed to be consciously evaluated and deliberately maintained, modified, or replaced based on whether it continued to serve the purposes that made royal holiday traditions meaningful. This required not just understanding what had worked in the past, but anticipating what would be needed for these traditions to remain viable in the future. As the evening light faded outside the palace windows, Charles completed his review of the Christmas plans with a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. The months of careful preparation would culminate in celebrations that appeared natural and effortless, disguising the enormous coordination required to make them possible. But that invisible infrastructure was precisely what allowed these traditions to create the authentic moments of connection and meaning that justified their continuation. The documents he approved that evening would set in motion the activities of hundreds of people across multiple locations, from the gardeners who would cultivate the perfect Christmas trees to the chefs who would prepare traditional holiday meals, from the security personnel who would ensure safe public events to the conservators who would carefully handle historical decorations. Each person's contribution would be essential to creating the experiences that maintained the monarchy's connection to both its history and its contemporary relevance. Charles understood that his role in this process was not to control every detail, but to provide clear guidance about the values and purposes these traditions should serve. His decisions about which customs to maintain, which to modify, and which innovations to embrace would influence royal Christmas celebrations for generations to come. The responsibility was enormous, but it was also profoundly meaningful, an opportunity to ensure that future royal families would inherit traditions that continued to provide genuine connection, authentic celebration, and purposeful service. As he prepared to leave his study, Charles paused to look at a photograph on his desk showing 4 generations of his family participating in the previous year's Christmas celebrations. His mother, himself, William, and George were captured in a moment of genuine enjoyment during the Boxing Day walk, their faces showing the kind of natural happiness that made these traditions worthwhile. The photograph reminded him that all the planning, coordination, and careful decision-making ultimately served one purpose: creating opportunities for authentic human connection and meaningful family celebration that honored both the past and the future.